Welcome to the Fourth Branch program. Glad you can make it. I am MD. This program is dedicated exclusively for those with common sense, a spirit of patriotism, and a determination for a more perfect union. Stay tuned as we begin the discussion of a very important, interesting, and enlightening topic. Hope to hear from you soon. Happy listening. Abraham Lincoln said, "You can fool all of the people some of the time. Some of the people all of the time, but you cannot fool all the people all the time." Tyson Fury claims that racism is a sign of ignorance. Ignorance is the biggest threat to any democracy. It is, however, the ignorance of the ignorance which represent the greatest danger to society. It is what turns an ignorant man into a lunatic. Thus lies the danger, the peril even of a man, a community, a state, a country, yes, even a society. John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, said that the ignorance of one voter in a democracy impairs the security of us all. Indeed, it does. We've seen it, have we not? We've witnessed it. We are all living it, are we not? All men are born ignorant. Many have chosen to stay and live in ignorance. Only a few recognize ignorance is indeed the root and stem of all evil and choose to be ignorant no more. Hello everyone, I am MD and this is the Fourth Branch program. First, a warning. This program is not suitable for all audiences. I repeat, the content of this program is not for everyone. To find out if it's suitable to you, answer the following two questions. Question 1. Would you entrust your teenage daughter to a non-rapist? Question 2. Would you have a non-pedophile cared for your toddler? Once again, question 1. Would you entrust your teenage daughter to a non-rapist? Question 2. Would you have a non-pedophile cared for your toddler? your time is up, obviously. If you had difficulty answering either question, this program is not for you. If you answer yes to either or to both questions, this program is definitely not for you. But if both of your answers are absolutely not, this program is catered exclusively to you. You should stick around. It is enlightening, educational, and informative. Join me here on the fourth branch at 10:30 a.m. every Saturday. And every weekday at 2 p.m. This is the fourth branch.
Common sense in a world of chaos.
This program will resume in just a moment. Hello everyone, my name is Mike Duchesne, MD for short. Welcome to the fourth branch program. Today we have a very special edition of the program, a continuation of the conversation on slave trades. First, let's address a few of the issues around this program. War on Blacks. The title of this program was not picked lightly. It is not for sensationalism. It is not for slogan. It is meant to express the reality about Blacks. War suggests casualties. And indeed, the Blacks community now and in the past have had a lot of casualties, and those casualties continue to mount. But War on Blacks is not here just to tally casualties on Blacks, but rather as a venue to discuss a very sensitive topic, race relation in America, which is in of itself a very complex topic to talk about. You see, Blacks are overwhelmingly emotional about race relation, and for good reasons. They have lived through racism, discrimination, prejudice every single day, everywhere, in every aspect. They've experienced it regularly. They've witnessed it very frequently. They even become victims of such. Whites, on the other hand, are much less concerned, for good reason as well, although this is changing. The predicament doesn't impact them directly. As such, they ignore it altogether. They shrug it off repeatedly. They condone it subconsciously. They nurture it selfishly, and they even normalize it naturally. Sounds a very simple recipe to help solve the problem, doesn't it? But unfortunately, as we mentioned earlier, race relation is a very complex issue. Now, here in America, it has been a major problem. Now, War on Blacks is chosen in order to point to those casualties that the Blacks race have been suffering for centuries now. It started in 1492 when transcontinental slave trades began. Officially, it ended in 1865 when Abraham Lincoln signed the executive order for the emancipation of slavery. That should have been the end of it. Unfortunately, it is not. Why do we call it war on blacks? Let's look at the data, shall we? As mentioned today, we will be talking about slave trades. But if you look around you, everything that is set by the system, by society, is meant to inflict casualties on blacks. And we're not just talking about physical casualties. Now, war on blacks is meant to fill a very important void in the conversation about race relations in America. You see, every time that a black individual falls victim of the system of society, there are protests and a number of quote-unquote experts come on TV parading and talking about what needs to happen. And the common theme has always been, we need to talk more about race relations in the country. Great. Except that it doesn't happen. It lasts for a day or two, and it goes away until the next casualty. And it goes on, and as I mentioned, it has been for centuries here in the United States. Some are exhausted about having to take stock of the casualties. It's frustrating, it is irritating, and it seems to fall on deaf ears. Why is that? Here in America, there are two very large groups of individuals which comprise the white society. One, there are millions and millions of whites who are racist, who discriminate, and who would want blacks not to succeed or to go away. But unfortunately, or fortunately, there are also millions and millions of whites who do not discriminate and who are not racist. Thus, the big problem in the conversation about race relations in America. Now, you may recall that the emancipation of slavery happened after a bloody civil war. That was the civil war between those, the whites, who wanted to keep slavery around, and those, the other side, the whites, who wanted to end slavery. As such, as you can see, race relation is a very difficult thing. It is violent, it is even bloody. Now, why is that? As we look through history, we find that most of the whites who want to keep things the way they were, who wanted to keep slavery around, are in the South. And a number of whites who wanted to end slavery are in the north part of the country. As we continue the conversation about race relation, of course, war on blacks, we will show you why that is. Now, it has always been that way for a number of people, and never a question as to why the South is more racist, discriminate more towards black than the North. And we will find that out as well as we continue the conversation about race relation in America. In the meantime, I would like to set the record straight. We know that there are millions and millions of whites who do not discriminate, who are not racist. And we also know there are millions and millions of whites who are racist and who discriminate. And we are not talking about white nationalists. We are not talking about KKK. Those are very small group, very small number of people. And we know that because our society has that very problem that we're talking about. If that weren't so, the problem would not have been a problem at all. Now, war on blacks suggests casualties. And yes, blacks have suffered a number of casualties. Now, we always refer to police brutality and police execution of blacks on the street as an example to prove that's indeed the case. At a time, it was all but ignored by the white society because lives of blacks do not matter as much as those of whites. We know that. Slavery is one of such instance that clearly tells us that's the case. And beyond slavery, we know that it took a lot of effort, a lot of violence, a lot of lies through civil war, through protests, for even to get the right to vote, has caused a lot of people to have lost their lives. As such, we cannot deny the fact here in the United States of America, racism and discrimination have been causing a lot of casualties on the black sides of the war, which is the unfortunate part because usually in any war, casualties happen on both sides. But unfortunately for the blacks, this war is one-sided because only the blacks are suffering casualties. Now, why do we talk about casualties? Some of them are not physical at all. But let's take a look at the example of police execution of unarmed black individual on the street. When indiscriminately a police officer shoot a black individual, unarmed black individual, now we're talking about casualty. There is always a spinning of the information, excuses, and so on. And usually, the excuse that the police officer always present for doing so is, I was afraid for my life. Go figure. Unarmed, black man, a police officer, trained, afraid for his life to the point that he has to pull his gun and shoot. Not once, not twice, several times, and in many occasions unload his weapon on that unarmed black individual. How afraid can that police officer be really to do that? Now, this is casualty, physical casualty, and it's just one individual. But the casualties continue to mount. There is psychological casualties, there is emotional casualty, and there is financial casualty because the individual that the police officer just gunned down most of the time has a family, a wife, kids left behind to fend for themselves. Emotional casualty, those kids will grow up without a father, will grow up without any possibility of receiving guidance of sort in order to fit in within society. And those kids, sometimes they become very bad because there is this emotional casualty that continue to ravage that family, and that creates a different sort of casualty, psychological casualty. And of course, the spouse now is in a financial situation where it becomes even harder for that individual to move any further in the social ladder. So yes, it is a war on blacks because what I just described to you very rarely happen to a white individual under the very same circumstance. Now let's look at another predicament. Two individuals walking down the street, a black and a white. The black is stopped, searched, deprived of even his own constitutional rights on the street, and found a small packet of cocaine or marijuana. And mind you that the white that just went by had the exact same packet of marijuana in his pocket as well, but wasn't stopped. That black individual is arrested, thrown in jail, and his life destroyed. War on blacks, another casualty in the black community. Let's look at the normal course of life. Job. Two individuals walk into a place, apply for a job, black qualify, may even have higher education. Not hired, the white is hired. Casualty of war, blacks. The examples are many. The examples are plenty. But unfortunately, it is very difficult to point fingers to those who discriminate and who are racist. Because how do you walk away from a predicament and say that I did not get the job because, I'm black? The information is not available. The reason is not given to you. Me personally, I was told in many occasions, because obviously of my background, they couldn't say I wasn't qualified. They say I was overqualified for the job. That's another way of denying employment to a black individual. Yes, it is a war on blacks. Two people walk into a hospital, the blacks will have less care than the whites. Why is that? Under the same circumstance, no insurance for the white, no insurance for the black. Yes, it is indeed a war on black. Now, the only way to solve that problem is to recognize that there is indeed a problem. No scientist can cure a disease unless the scientists understand the problem. Remember Ebola? When Ebola was ravaging the whole world, and there was a race for a cure. And the race really was to find out, to understand the disease in order to bring a cure. The same predicament here in the United States of America about race relation is necessary in order to fix the problem. It is a lingering problem. It needs to be fixed, but unless and until we accept the fact that there is a problem, we're not going to get a solution. In the introduction, I mentioned that it would have been nice to know if someone is racist, if someone discriminates. And we know that we encounter those individuals on a regular basis. How do we know? Those examples I just gave you, there are plenty that abound. Unfortunately, there is no label, there is no sign that tells you, don't even bother applying for this job, because the individual that's going to interview you is not going to hire you because you're a black individual. And I even made mention that it is nice to know that the white nationalists, the KKK, they make it very easy to identify them. And that would have made things much easier. Unfortunately, it is not so. So blacks are left to fend for themselves. They didn't create the problem. Society, the white society did, and they continue to wage that war. As we continue to debate the slave trades, we will show you that this is not an accident. All those examples I just gave you, and many more that I will present to you during the course of this conversation, that this is not an accident. This is not just something that happened in the fringe of society. This is a systematic effort by the white society to make certain that it stays that way. Look at the legislation that's passed in Washington. They are legislation that are on the face detrimental to the blacks community. Let's look at the law. The law are passed to be overwhelmingly detrimental to blacks. War on blacks. Look at what happened just a few weeks ago. The Republican Senate picked a judge who is publicly known to be racist, suppressing blacks' votes, minority votes, and now Republican senator, overwhelmingly all of them except two, which I mentioned in the introduction, wants to place that judge on the federal bench, only a heartbeat away from becoming a justice, Supreme Court justice. Now, they know the information. Those information are available to them, and yet they didn't even flinch or blink to say, let's just put that individual on the federal bench. Yes, it is a war on blacks, and it is not an accident. It is done systematically, not discreetly, publicly. As I mentioned before, Mitch McConnell is a very smart individual, but we can say without any hesitation that he is also racist. Now, yes, of course, he will argue that point because it is easy for anyone to deny anything. But don't tell me what you are or are not. Show me. And Mitch McConnell has proven beyond a shred of a doubt that every single one of his decisions is meant to inflict casualty on blacks, including the example I just gave you about that judge who is known by everybody, by people in North Carolina, that guy, he doesn't mince words. He doesn't hide his true feeling. He is a racist. And this is the guy that Mitch McConnell wants to put on the federal bench. This is clearly an action that tells you that where Mitch McConnell's heart is. This is not politics. It is a systematic effort to continue to inflict casualties on blacks. And there is no denying that. Gradually, we will identify those individuals who are racist or discriminate, but unfortunately, there are millions of such individuals. And you can identify some of those individuals yourself when you have a conversation. They're always the first to deny of the problem. They're always the first to argue against the problem. They're always the first to minimize the problem in the country about race relations. They have their explanation right at their fingertips to say, no, it's not that bad. They're also the same people who used to shrug off the fact that blacks were being brutalized, were being killed indiscriminately by police officers on the street until technology started showing that is the case. So we know that there is this problem, that there are millions of whites who discriminate and who are racist. And there are millions of others who do not and who are not racist. Thus, the major problem in the country. But the war on blacks is real and it continues to inflict casualties on the blacks. So the purpose of this is to continue to identify those areas where blacks are suffering casualties, be it physical, emotional, psychological, and financials. And this way, if indeed those who want to help solve that problem, that lingering problem in the country, can join in helping. That's why our mantra is here. Be part of the solution or get out of the way. Because we know those who do not want to help with this solution, with this problem, are part of the problem. So we do not expect everyone to help or to want to help solve this lingering problem in the country. As mentioned, during the Civil War, millions of whites side with those who want to keep slavery around. Yes, those whites did not disappear. Their ancestors passed information down, and they still the same group that continue to argue for black to stay in their place. As such, we know that this program, as we already found out, a number of people have already told us what they think. There is no war on blacks. How would you know? Every single day, everywhere, in every aspect, be it in legislation being passed in Washington, law, police officer, education, job, no matter where you look, casualties are mounting on the blacks community. As such, we know there is indeed a war on blacks. We will address the topic of the day, which is slave trades. And this topic, as I mentioned before, we're not here to teach you about slavery. We're not here to teach you about history, but we're here to take part of history that help us understand why we're still coping with racism and discrimination in the United States of America. And as we begin to understand and we begin to see where the mind was being shaped, especially for those who were with that frame of mind, who continue to be in that frame of mind, once they understand where that comes from, maybe, just maybe, they too will join the revolution of equality in the United States. There is indeed a war on blacks, and that war has been causing many casualties. And we are, with this program, trying to make certain that it is understood that we blacks, are suffering casualties, and it's time to end this war. Hi, I am MD, host of the Fourth Branch program. War on Blacks is a new topic added to the Fourth Branch programming in order to discuss the intricacies, the complexities of race relations in America. The goal is threefold. 1, to bring attention to the various forms of prejudice, discriminations, and racism in the country. 2, to expose the undeniable presence of such in every aspect of life and every corner of our society. 3, to extricate us all from the ignorance, the indifference, or the complicity. The ultimate objective is to make the discussions of those issues, racism, prejudice, discrimination, a normal part of our lives. Then, and only then, will we, as a society, be able to eradicate the problem. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." Abraham Joshua Heschel exclaimed, "Racism is man's gravest threat to man, the maximum of hatred for the minimum of reason." Join me in the journey to restore equality. Or would you please get out of the way? Thank you. in the United States, I mentioned earlier that slavery started since 1492. But here in the United States, it started in 1619. That was the first time in Jamestown, Virginia, that was at that time a British colony, where the very first shipment of blacks, at that time called Negroes, came, and 20 blacks were sold in Jamestown, Virginia. Now, I want to make certain that it is understood, because I heard a number of comments from people who are trying to make a differentiation between different owners and different slave owners and different slave masters. And they have come up with to the conclusion that there were some good slave owners and there are some good slave masters. Now, I'm going to make a blanket statement, which is 100% true. There was no such thing as good slave owners. There was no such thing as good slave masters. The word good does not belong with slave owners, does not belong with slave masters. And it's not just because of the act itself, because slavery in and of itself is already bad, but because of what we will show you shortly. There is no such thing, because slavery, there were different time during slavery that you will find that there is a shift in behavior among the slave owners and the slave masters. Although we're not here to really discuss at length the actual period in time, but because somebody mentioned that, because obviously there must have been information passed from one generation to the other and trying to paint their ancestor, whether it's great grandpa, as being a decent man, someone who was good to slave. I want to address that to a certain extent, but not in depth. So during slavery, slavery is trade. It's what you would call today human trafficking. But during slavery, the human trafficking aspect went beyond. In fact, blacks at that time was not considered as human. The way that they treated blacks, they were considered as merchandise. Now, this flyer that you're currently looking at on the screen was flyer that was made, usually passing the community, churches, places of gathering, where whites who have the privilege, the financial ability, would be able to buy the product, the merchandise, blacks. Now, there were some whites who would, just like here today, there are people who are in business who sell wholesale, and other people sell retail. Just if you go to a mom and pop store, grocery store, you buy thing retail for one individual consumption. But the wholesaler would buy bulk and sell it to those people who are gonna sell retail. So the same principle was there as well during that time. For instance, someone who was white individual was financially capable, would buy 100, 200, would require or purchase or order 200-300 blacks, would be wholesale, and they would go and sell 50 here, 50 there, especially for farming. They would be selling those to not necessarily retail, but individuals who do not need that many Negroes. They would buy 50, 30, 10, etc. or all the way to down to even people who may need just a couple of them, 2 or 3, for household, because they have no other need or use for help. And remember one thing, those were free labor. Yes, those blacks worked 18 plus hours in the field, in the farm, but they weren't getting paid. They weren't properly taken care of. In fact, a number of them died because of illness. A number of them died. Those who survived the journey. Remember, they were coming from Africa after being chased like animals, and those they could not capture, they killed because they had a rifle. And unfortunately for those blacks in Africa, they didn't have a way of countering those people who come to chase them and capture them. And once they get captured, they will be chained and they will be sold in the market. For instance, what you're currently looking at on your screen is a woman that was being branded, literally branded. And these images are rendering images that some artists look at history, because we did not have the ability at that time to have, at least they did not have photographs of those situations. So we have artists that, based on history, they were able to do rendering and show at that time what was going on during slavery time. Now, those individuals, as I mentioned, come from Africa. They went through what you'd call hell. After being chased like animals, those who were captured were chained and put on a boat for a journey that's going to be lasting weeks. And they were packed like sardines, literally, because whoever is going to make the journey, they want to have as many as possible during the journey, and for a number of reasons, because a number of those blacks are not going to make it to America because they will die. They could not sustain the journey, the inhuman treatment that they had to go through. And it was beyond word, beyond understanding how human beings were being treated by whites. Yes, it was then also a war on blacks. And I suspect those individuals who today are arguing there is no war on black would have said the exact same thing as well. There is no war on blacks. Chased in their own land, they never went and bothered anyone, living their life. Now they were on the run for their lives. Many of them were killed. Many were killed. And those who were captured had to go through severe, inhuman treatment, torture, beating, branding. Some of them would even get some of their limbs cut in order to instill fear and make certain that the others understand what awaits them if they do not obey. That was war on blacks. Now, if for those who survived the journey, those who managed to get here after weeks in a journey where they very seldom fed, taken care of properly, and they finally now for auction. What you're looking at is an auction of blacks. that picture is blacks being put down on the boat at the bottom of the boat for the journey. And this particular picture, and I want to show it to you in still picture instead of in a slide. What you're currently looking at is a rendering. The lady you see at the bottom is the mother of that child that you see being held with one hand by the auctioneer. Look at on the left hand side where it says great bargain, sale of Negroes, horses, cattle, and other properties. Yes, blacks were considered properties. And that child, which is literally a baby, being held in one hand by the auctioneer, that trying to sell that child, and that lady who is the mother is trying to plead with those people not to inflict harm on her child. There is no such thing as good slave owners. There is no such thing as good slave masters. Blacks were product, merchandise, and they treated them even worse than that. In fact, if we take it by today's standard, the way that blacks were treated, dogs today are treated better than blacks were treated then. In auction, blacks are sold in auction, including that black child, baby, ripped from his mother's womb, hands rather, and offered in auction. And once sold, that mother will never see that child again. I don't know who come with the idea or even with the expression of good slave owner or good slave master. Who came up with that expression? How do they figure there is such a thing? What exactly do they base that on? That rendering is not an exception. Mothers with small children, that's the way it went. They are separated from their family, husbands from their wives, mothers from their children, and mothers sold one place, children sold another place. That was the business. Slave trades. And it is worse than just trading. Today, when we talk about human trafficking, it's not that it's any better, but they could kidnap an individual on the street, and that individual is an individual that they kidnap, and they sold that individual for whatever reason, whether it's for prostitution or someone who is in need of a kid, whatever the case is. As bad as it sounds today, it was worse then. Because when they went to Africa to round blacks, people with families would most likely unable to flee. And that was harvest for those white hunters, because they get a whole family at once. Mother, father, and children all together, collected, put at the bottom of the boat, which means instead of running after one individual, they go into a place and they can easily get all of them together, because as it has always been, we living organism, we human, we fight to protect our offspring. So parents were there with their children and making sure that they're there with their children when whatever was happening happened to them all at once together. Now, that only was for the sake of getting them. Once they get to America, there was no longer a family. Wife sold in one place, children sold in another place, husbands sold in another place. Family separated. So the war on blacks have been inflicting casualties on blacks from the very beginning. Emotional casualties, psychological casualties, physical casualties. Yes, there has been a war on blacks. As I mentioned earlier, those individuals who are eager to deny or to reject that very fact are usually the same people who fought the war to keep blacks slaves. Those are the ones who, their family, their ancestors, of course, they weren't there because we're talking about generations before them, but they come from the same generations that wanted to keep slavery around. Which brings me to this conversation that I wish to have. If you were born in the United States before or during slavery, before slavery ended, you are part of this problem we're talking about. Yes, you may have not been born yet. Chances are you weren't born yet. But your ancestors, great, 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 great grandpa was a slave owner or a slave master. It makes a big difference in life in terms of whether you, although the words, the expression used interchangeably, but in the reality of the era, consider a slave owner as an individual who only have slaves that they consider their property, and they would not be interested in anything beyond that. Slave masters, on the other hand, not only they have that, but they may have different areas where they actually rule over the slave. For instance, they may have various farms to manage that they have, or they may be entrusted the disciplines of the slaves. But they do own slave as well. They did own slave as well. As I started saying, if you were born and your lineage comprises ancestors who were here during, before, and during slavery, before slavery ended, you are part of the problem. Indirectly, of course, but still. And the reason you become part of the problem is because what happened during slavery, which we will talk about as well, is the fact that as it is with living organism, you cannot continue to oppress an individual or a group without that person at some point muster enough strength, enough courage, and come up with a way to get out of the predicament. That is a human being. We cannot stay oppressed and not do anything. And if you understand how much torture, inhuman treatment that blacks had to go through, it is even baffling that it took that long for them to really do revolt against those kind of treatment. Now, don't get me wrong. History reports that every now and then you have a black slave who escaped and tried to get out of the predicament. More often than not, the black slave would be either captured or killed during hunting to get that individual back. But the majority of black slaves resigned themselves to their predicament for a very long time. And mostly because of the type of fear the slave owners, the slave master instill in them. And that's why when I hear the expression, good slave owner, good slave master, what exactly is that? Usually the people who may actually come up with that, it's almost a guarantee that that individual already identify himself or herself as having come from the lineage of someone, of an ancestor who was slave owner or slave master. And I'll explain in a minute why I say that. When during slavery, the individual, the slave owner or slave masters, they pay one-time fee, if you like, for the slave. And it's really cheap labor, because today if you employ someone, you have to continuously paying the individual as long as that individual is employed. But with purchases of slaves, there was only one fee, just the purchase price. You purchase a slave, and that was the end of the story. You don't have to pay anything anymore because you do not pay the slave. They weren't properly cared for. That's why a number of them also died while serving their respective masters. But the reason slavery lasted that long, and we're going to show you the different time in slavery, why even the slave masters or the slave owners had to change their ways slightly, and you will see that it's a normal human thing to do because of, and you'll see that maybe not today, but you'll see the reason behind that. In the beginning of the whole process, a slave owner buys, we're going to speculate, purchase 30 slaves. Most of them are going to be working on his farm. Your great grandpa, if you are white, follow that very closely, because I'm sure you have stories, especially if you were born in the United States of America before the end of slavery. If you had family, if you or prior your ancestor was born here in the United States before or during slavery, you also concerned about this topic because you indirectly have taken part in the problem. Now, you may not, I don't know where you may stand in the race relation discussion debate, but you are part of the problem if you come from a family whose ancestors was here, born or came here before end of slavery, you are part of the problem. Here's why. Your great grandpa, ancestor, whoever that is, purchased 30 slaves. Business transaction, right? Forget about the morality aspect of it, because we way past that. The minute that your great grandpa decided to purchase slave human being, the morality aspect was already out of the window. Now, your ancestor purchased those slaves. I would venture to say a number of them, or most of them, will be working on his farm, and may have a couple of them, usually women, who would be household, working in the house. You know, maid without being paid for. So the 30 slave, I'll take 3 out of those 30 and put them as household slaves. And the other 27 will be working on the farm, on the field, do whatever. Now, what you may not know, when stories are being passed to you by previous generation, because they're gonna pass down stories to tell you about your ancestor, great grandpa, how good your ancestor was with slaves. Yes, great grandpa had slaves, but he was a good man. I have no doubt he was a good father. I have no doubt he was a good husband. I have no doubt he could have been a good man. I have no doubt that all that could be true. Except for one problem. He wasn't any good slave master. And the reason I know that is because, number one, in the time period, blacks were considered merchandise, not even human beings, were treated as such. And that was a normal thing. Now, added to that, your ancestor, your great grandpa, paid for the merchandise and can do whatever he so wished with the merchandise. And they did. And there is no exception to that. They all did. Great grandpa would rape the house, the maid, without her consent, anytime he wanted. Yes, that nice man, that nice slave owner that they told you, that man that they told you was a good slave owner, at home, he raped the slave women at will, anytime he wanted. But that's small. Not that I'm minimizing raping, but in comparison to the slave on the field, you would say that was small. The slave in the field had to work 18 plus hours a day, non-stop. There was no lunch break. They had people, and your great grandpa included, with rifle and a whip. If a slave was to even looks like the slave was trying to slow down in what he was doing, he would be whipped to death. Yes, that great nice grandpa that they told you that they passed down to generation and say he was a good slave owner. Yes, that great grandpa would whip that slave to make certain that the slave would not only doesn't do that again, but the other slave do not show any sign of such, of slowing down. Yes, they had to work 18 hours and they take turn doing those kind of things. Now, the whipping part, what you may not know about, the whipping part happened the following way. They would tie both hands and pin down on the ground, both feet pinned down on the ground, the slave on his chest, and he will be beat until he bleed. Yes, that nice grandpa that they tell you was a good slave owner. Do you see anything good about that? Work an individual 18 plus hours a day who could not even show sign of being tired. And if he did, that person would be beaten to death until that person bleed. And when they finish beating that individual, while bleeding, he had to go back and continue what he was doing. On the field, scorching sun or cold winter did not matter. Yes, there has been a war on blacks. Contrary to what you've been hearing from your family, if you are white and your ancestor, I'm not talking about white that come in the country in the 20th century. They have their own, they fall into a different category. They could be racist as well. They could discriminate as well. I'm not talking about those. Referring that if you are white and your ancestors were in the country before the end of slavery, you are part of this problem we're talking about. Although indirectly, we understand you weren't born yet. You didn't trade any slave. You have nothing to do with that. Now, what you have, unfortunately, because why you don't have anything to do with that, stories were passed down to you to paint this ugly picture of blacks being violent. And I'll show you why that picture was painted. But your great-grandpa was such a nice man. I don't understand how that black slave could have done that to him. You see the contradiction in the story? A nice ancestor who was slave owner, beating slave to death, killing them when necessary, chasing them down when they run and escape from slavery, from inhuman treatment. And if they could not be caught, they would be killed without having to give any account to having killed a human being. But your great-grandpa, according to the story you've been told, was a nice man. He was a nice slave owner. He treated people right. No, he did not. He raped the women, the black women slave who were in his house, and he mistreated the slave that were working 18 hours for him on the field. And he had no account to give to anyone. There is no such thing as nice slave owner. I know that story was passed down to you, and they even show you picture of ancestor standing or sitting next to a maid, well, unpaid maid, that is, smiling when it becomes possible to have picture taken, and they show you that picture and they say, oh, that was so sweet, my great grandpa was so nice to slave. And I, again, as mentioned, as we continue that conversation, because we have to take you to those different times during slavery, although we're not covering everything about slavery, but to show you why the change in behavior that will come later, and why you were told a lie about your great grandpa was so nice to slaves. There is nothing to capture the horror of the horrific treatment that slave owners inflicted on slaves. Thus, the word, the attribute good cannot apply. So the story you were told that your ancestor was good to slaves, untrue, completely untrue. Just pure 100% lie. There is no truth to it. Now, there is a reason they have to tell you that story. You grew up in a religious family. Or you go to church, you pray, you thank God for all the wealth He has given you, for the good life that you had, that you have. And you sneer at the blacks that live next to you. That's poor. That's living in filth. That's struggling. That's not your fault. You weren't born yet. But the story that they told you harden your heart to the point that you see that black individual as more an enemy than a victim of your ancestors. Again, as we continue to tell you the story, you're going to see that the sentiment that you have as an individual, a white individual, towards blacks was passed down to you in stories that painted the blacks as violent, as bad, as undeserving, while your great-grandpa was so nice. So that was the picture of your ancestor, the slave owner. The picture that they painted of him was, gee, that guy was such a nice guy. He was really very good with slaves, but he was starving them to death. Did you know that blacks who work 18 hours a day on the field had to go and steal to eat in order to live because their slave owners were starving them to death? Yes, that great grandpa, that nice great grandpa that was so good to blacks, starved them to death as a form of punishment. But he was nice. He beat them until they bled. But, well, yes, that great grandpa was that nice guy that they painted down to you. And as such, you grew up thinking Oh my God, why are blacks so bad? Because the story that you were told were your great, 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 great grandpa, slave owner, was doing everything nice for blacks. And you know what those violent people did to him? They kill him. But the story that they fail to say is blacks could not take the inhuman treatment anymore. At some point, they had to escape. And we will get to that. This is slave rebellions. We're not talking about that, but I want you to understand the complexity of why you feel the way you feel about blacks. It's not blacks and white. Race relation is not blacks and white because, well, it is not. Because all your life, stories that come from previous generation, great grandpa, pass it down to great grandpa, pass it down to great grandpa, pass it down to grandpa, pass it down to your father or mother, and now pass down to you. And what you know of blacks, they are violent people because, well, a black individual killed great grandpa. Or it could have been more, not necessarily your family. It could have been great grandpa of that neighbor next door. Joe, assuming you John, or your father is John, the neighbor next door is Joe. So your family may have not suffered the same consequences, but it runs in your community, in your environment, that a black individual killed Joe's ancestor. Yes, Joe's ancestor, Joe's great grandpa was killed by a black. You know those violent people? But the story that's missing, that they never pass down to you because they're not telling you that part of the story, that Joe's ancestor, or yours, because I'm trying to mix it here so that you understand the complexity of the whole history of race relation in America. It's not simple, it's complex. The image that they paint to you is your ancestors were good people. Really, they provide for their family. They work hard. They did everything to make sure we have a good life. What do you think happened to the ancestors of the blacks, of the black that live next door or across the street? What do you think happened to his ancestors? Yes, you look at the black that lives a few blocks down the road or across the street or not too far away from you. A poor family that's struggling in life. You sneer at them, you talk about them, you're afraid of them. The reason is very simple. The image that they paint for you about the slave owners, who happen to be your ancestor, great, put as many great as you can behind grandpa, was slave owner. Now, the black family or the black man that you notice a few blocks away across the street from you? His ancestors, great, 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 great grandpa, was a slave. And as fate usually has it, could have been a slave for your ancestor, a slave of your ancestor. Of course, you're afraid of blacks because, well, blacks are violent people. Where did you get that idea? Very simple. Your family painted that picture of your ancestor being nice people who take care of family, who take care of kids, he was even in church praying. Good man. And the other side of the coin, they paint the picture of those black slaves who were ungrateful, violent, and criminal. Why? Because they could not take the inhuman treatment anymore. They had to escape. So when they finally find a way to do so, anybody that they find on their path, yes, they will hit you hard, very hard. Yes, in the process, they kill. But the part of the story that's always missing when they were passing it to you is the treatment that they were getting was so inhuman that they would rather die than staying in that predicament. So the first opportunity that they found that they had, yes, they escaped. And in the process of escaping, whoever that they find in their path, they kill. Now, Grandpa was still a good man for beating slaves to death, still a good man for cutting the slave finger to make an example out of him. Grandpa was a great man, a decent man for letting that man bleeding on the scorching sun, unclothed, or in the cold, unclothed, untreated, to continue to work the field. But he was a good man. That's the story they pass to you. That's why you feel such resentment towards blacks, because you only got the story of your ancestor being that good. But blacks, gee, they had to do things that were bad. Yeah, they did things during rebellion. They kill their kill masters on their way to freedom. And that's what people who are bound do. But that's not the way that they pass down that story to you. The way they pass down that story is because, you know, those blacks, they're criminal, they're violent. You should have seen what they did to a number of people in the neighborhood. They killed the whole family. Two different pictures. Your great-grandpa, nice man, smiling with his hand around his family's kids, grandkids, great-grandkids at the table eating, nice family. Now, the juxtaposition of that are those blacks on the field working 18 hours without any break in between, being treated inhumanly, beaten to death, starving to death. No family. Their family were stripped away from them. But your great-grandpa suffered violence from those, you know, those criminals, those monsters. This is what the two pictures that presented to you as white, you grew up, of course, not just you, your grandpa, your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, and probably his great-grandfather grew up in an environment where that information is passed that way. And he passed it. Every time he sees a black passing by, he passes the information to the next generation. And the next generation gets it. Blacks, violent, criminal, stay away. Great-great-grandpa pass it to great-grandpa, great-grandpa pass it to grandpa, grandpa pass it to father, and father now pass it to you. And as far as you're concerned, blacks are violent, criminals, and thieves. War on blacks. So everything that you do is to inflict casualties on blacks, because your mind already ingrained and imprinted with this, because you've been hearing it. It's been in your families forever. But you never stop 1 second and ask. It is a simple question. At the time that those things happened, what was going on? Did you know that blacks were hunted down in Africa, captured like animals, chained, brought here to America in a journey that lasted weeks? Some of them died in the process, and when they came here, they get sold like merchandise, separated from their family. And on top of that, all that happened to them that weren't enough. Now they were being tortured. But they the criminals. You know, those damn blacks, they are criminals, because they had to kill their way out of freedom. But they are the violent one. They are the criminals. What a mind job in American society. Forget about what they did to them, that they did all that. Forget about that, because that was okay. You know, it was the time that they go and hunt down blacks and pick them up and bring them to America to work on the field for free. You know, that was the time. They beat the crap out of them. They beat them to death. They cut their limbs. They tortured them. You know, that was the time. But they are the criminals. Hi, I am MD, host of the Fourth Branch program. War on Blacks is a new topic added to the Fourth Branch programming in order to discuss the intricacies, the complexities of race relations in America. The goal is threefold. 1. To bring attention to the various forms of prejudice, discriminations, and racism in the country. 2. To expose the undeniable presence of such in every aspect of life and every corner of our society. 3. To extricate us all from the ignorance, the indifference, or the complicity. The ultimate objective is to make the discussions of those issues, racism, prejudice, discrimination, a normal part of our lives. Then, and only then, will we, as a society, be able to eradicate the problem. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." Abraham Joshua Heschel exclaimed, Racism is man's gravest threat to man, the maximum of hatred for the minimum of reason. Join me in the journey to restore equality. Or would you please get out of the way? Thank you. As it might already become obvious to you by now, race relation is very complex. Here in America, it is even more so because the country is divided and there are a number of subgroups in the white white society. As we continue to discuss this very important topic, as mentioned before, the only way to find a cure for a problem is to understand the problem. And the purpose of discussing slave trades, which we will continue because we have to show you, we will move past beyond the auctioning of blacks to them working on the field, and also to rebellion, because the picture that I started to talk about, which shows two different pictures, the slave owner being good and the slaves being bad, that has its origin during slavery. And of course, as you will see, as we heading towards the time of emancipation, towards the Civil War, and you will also start noticing a shift in the way that slave owners think, the way that they behave. But for all purpose of this conversation, there is, number one, no good slave owners. There is no good slave masters. No matter what you heard, yes, you can talk about a good grandpa, a good great grandpa, a husband, a wife, and a father, and so on. But there is no good slave owner. And war on blacks has been since here in the United States since 1619. That's when the first shipment of blacks happened in America. As I mentioned, in Jamestown, Virginia, when that first happened was 1619. And since then, there has been war on blacks. Keep in your mind the example I just gave you. When you see a black individual who is struggling financially, not because he didn't try, not because he doesn't want to get out of the predicament, but because of circumstances that you indirectly may even be responsible of. And as we continue that conversation, you will notice that a lot of the blacks have always been the victim in the United States. From the time that they were picked up in Africa, and by picked up, I don't mean nicely, chased, killed, captured like animal, from the time that happened to here in the United States, they have been victimized by the system, by society. But there is a very interesting way that white society has always tried to turn the table. It's still here today, ironically. And you would ask yourself, why are they still using the same excuse today as they used during slavery? Tune into Fox, a black that's executed by a cop on the street is the victim by any analysis. But at Fox, that person deserves what happened to him because, well, he is a black. That's been waging war on blacks in America. It has not stopped. Now that you know, it's easier to pinpoint those who may be racist, who discriminate, or who may even come from those lineages of families who own slaves, who fought in the Civil War to keep slavery around. It may not be that difficult after we finish with this program, we finish with slavery, that discussion. It may not be difficult for you to pinpoint those people very quickly. They're the first one to reject the idea of discrimination or racism in the country. They're the first one to reject the idea of there is a war on black. They're the first one to reject the idea, oh, well, you didn't get this job because of discrimination, or you didn't get that because of discrimination. They very always eager to say that's not the case. And this way you start understanding why we are, as a country, in the predicament that we are today. It's not by accident. We will continue to bring forth example from slavery and working our way towards today. Because there is a huge misunderstanding as to why things are the way they are today for blacks. There is, and I will discuss the 4 different groups of whites because I mentioned there are 2 major groups: those who are racist and who discriminate, and those who are not racist and who do not discriminate. But within those 2 groups, there are subgroups, and I will show to you why that topic is so difficult to have, and why race relation in America is such a complex issue. I do thank you for taking the time to listen to this program, and I invite you to be with me Monday at 2 p.m. That is when our next program continue about war on blacks, as well as we will discuss democracy in America, which is also another very important topic that we have been discussing. And if you have questions, you have comments, you have suggestions, please, by all means, do let us know. You have a way to make this program better? We will be very, very grateful to hear from you as to how to make this better, because it's not going away. This program is not going away, because discussing race relation in America is important to solve race relation problem in America. But in order to solve that problem, we have to understand where it comes from. And my own personal experience, interaction with others, clearly tell me that most whites, especially those who are racist or discriminate, they have no understanding whatsoever where that comes from. Some of them, they, just like you see, if someone is Republican, they vote Republican. They say, my family has been voting Republican. They don't even know why. They've been voting that way, and they continue to vote that way for no other reason than their families have been voting that. Same thing with race relation. They have stories that have been passed to them, and they internalize that story, those stories rather, and they sin every time that they see a black individual. The first thing that comes to their mind is one of those stories. They never question it. They just internalize it. And everything that they do in life is influenced by those stories that they know. And this program is to tell you the real story behind what happened. And you can make up your mind as to how you want to continue to live the life. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. And I hope to see you again on Monday at 2 p.m. I am MD, host of the Fourth Branch program, inviting you to join me every Saturday at 10:30 a.m. and every weekday at 2 p.m. for discussions of social political issues and to dissect the meaning and the importance of current events, as well as to understand topics of legislations. The Fourth Branch Project is not associated with any political party, and we at the Fourth Branch do not have any political agenda or aspiration. Our ultimate objective is to work towards achieving a more perfect union by removing ignorance, the biggest obstacle to our democracy. Join me on our next social media broadcast. See you then.
The Fourth Branch Podcast is brought to you in collaboration with the People Branch publication, which can be found on the People Branch website, located at peoplebranch.org. That's peoplebranch.org. That's peoplebranch.org website, in which you will find a number of very interesting articles. My name is Mike Duchesne, MD for short. I hope you have a great afternoon or a great evening, whichever it happens to be. Hopefully you can join me again next time for another interesting episode of this podcast. That was the Fourth Branch, live from New York. Good day.